Hello everyone, and welcome back to Aliens After Dark. Every night on this channel I share alien and UFO encounter stories, told softly to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, get comfortable. Let your eyes close if they want to, and let's begin. Something was waiting at a place that had only ever been said out loud inside two airplanes, 80 miles away from me, on a radio I could not hear. My name is Charmaine. I was 26 that autumn, and I was an operations specialist, which means I sat at a radar console in a dark room on a guided missile cruiser and told people what was in the sky. We were working with a carrier off the coast of Southern California. It was the middle of November in 2004. I want to be careful with how I tell this because most of it is very boring, and the boring part matters. The room I worked in had no windows. It was kept cold, about 62 degrees, and it was kept dark, and everything in it was lit blue by the displays. When you first come off a ladder into a room like that, you cannot see anything at all for about a minute. Then your eyes settle, and you can see 20 people sitting in rows in the blue, all of them wearing headsets, none of them looking at each other. It smells like cold electronics and old coffee. Somebody always has cough drops. The sound is fans, mostly. Fans, and the little plastic click of trackballs and a chair. My watch was 5 hours at a time. 5 hours in that chair with a headset on, talking almost the whole time. Your hands get cold before your arms do. That is a thing nobody tells you. We were 6 days into a workup, which is the long rehearsal you do before you deploy. Everybody is tired in a particular way during a workup, not exhausted, just permanently 1 hour short for weeks, so that your sense of what is normal drifts a little without you noticing. I slept 4.5 hours at a stretch and thought I was fine. I probably was fine. I mention it because it is the second thing anybody says to me when I tell them this, and I would rather say it myself. I had a photograph taped to the rim of my console. My sister's girl, about 3 years old, holding a plastic shovel. It was the only thing in that entire room that was any color other than blue, and I used to look at it when the picture was quiet, the way you look out of a window. The work itself is simple to describe. There are things in the sky. Some of them are ours, and they carry a little box that answers when you ask, and those come up on the display already labeled. Some of them are not ours, or the box is off, or the box is broken, and then all you have is the return itself, which is just energy coming back off something solid. You look at where it is and where it was, and you decide what it is, then you say so out loud. That is the job. You say so out loud, and other people make decisions on the strength of what you said. I had been doing it about 6 years by then. I was good at it. I say that plainly, not proudly, because it matters to what comes after. That same month I had killed 2 tracks. The first was a temperature inversion out to the west, which will hand you a beautiful solid contact sitting at 4,000 feet doing nothing, and it will do it for hours. The second was birds. A big raft of them coming off the islands, moving at about the speed of a light aircraft, and if you are tired you will call it. I did not call either one. I looked at both of them and said, "That is not an aircraft." And I was right both times, and I was told I was right. So when they wanted somebody to look at a picture that seemed wrong, they tended to call me over. That was my reputation in that room. I was the one who did not get excited. I had a habit too. Every time I took a new track, I wrote the time on the plexiglass with a grease pencil, up in the top corner, and the track number underneath it. Green pencil. I had done it since I was 19. At the end of watch, I wiped the corner with my sleeve and went to eat. It was not required, it was just mine. The first night, the track came up above 80,000 feet. Nothing flies at 80,000 feet in an operating area like that. Nothing we had, nothing anybody had that anybody would send out to sit above a training exercise off Mexico. I checked the picture. The picture was clean. No clutter, no interference anywhere else on the scope, nothing hanging on any other bearing. If a system is going to invent something for you, it usually invents a lot of it, all over, at once. This was one thing, in one place, and everything else on my display was exactly as sensible as it had been 10 minutes before. I called it. Somebody wrote it down. Then it came down. I have said this sentence out loud maybe 40 times in 20 years, and I still do not have a good way to say it. My radar took a certain amount of time to complete a sweep. In one sweep, the track was above 80,000. In the next, it was near the water, so it was at both altitudes and, in a manner of speaking, at neither, because the machine never caught it in between. There is no rate you can write down for that. I did not write a rate. I wrote where it was, and then it sat there, about 20,000 feet more or less, doing nothing whatsoever, for a long time. There was no box answering when we asked. There was no identification of any kind. There was nothing on any acoustic gear, which there would not necessarily be. But I want to be complete. There was no wake under it on the sea return. And the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I noticed that first night without knowing I was noticing it, is that nobody on any circuit anywhere in that strike group sounded surprised. Not calm, not professional, unsurprised. There is a difference, and you can hear it. Then it came back the next day, and the next, and the next. That is the part people are not ready for when I tell it. They want one night. It was not one night. It was 4 days in a row, in the same rough patch of sky, in the same band of hours, and by about the third morning a chief walking behind my chair with a coffee said, "Good morning" to it. Out loud, as a joke. Everybody laughed, including me. That is what I mean about the boring part mattering. A thing can be impossible on Monday and furniture by Thursday. Human beings will do that to anything. I laughed at the joke, and then I sat there and thought, we have all gone completely mad in about 72 hours, and nobody is going to say so. I should describe it, and I cannot, and that is the honest answer. On my display it was a shape about the size of a fingernail, and shapes on a display are not shapes. What I can tell you is what it would not do. It would not hold a heading long enough to be going anywhere. It would not slow down before it stopped. It would not put anything out that any of our equipment could find. No signal, no noise, nothing warm. It was a solid return, and it behaved like a decision rather than an object. On the 5th day, they sent airplanes. I am not going to tell you what the pilots saw because I was not there, and it is not mine. I will tell you what happened in my room. They went out. I had them on my display, and I had, for a while, the other thing, and then I did not have the other thing at all. It was simply not on my scope anymore. Nothing where they were, nothing where it had been. And I sat with a very clean, very empty picture, and I remember being annoyed, in the way you are annoyed when you have gone to a lot of trouble, and the trouble evaporates. They came back after a while. There was chatter on the circuits, and some of it was loud. Somebody laughed the way you laugh when you have been startled and would rather not have been. And then somebody in my room said the words software fault. And I want to tell you honestly what those 2 words did to me. They were wonderful. I built a whole house on them in about 90 seconds. A bad range gate, a timing error deep in the system that would only show at extreme altitude, which nobody would ever have caught. Because nobody ever looks up there, a patch we would take on the beach in January. I had 2 good hours inside that house. I even wrote down, on a corner of paper, what I would need to prove it, because I wanted to be the one who proved it. Then the technicians ran the checks. in front of me twice, because I asked for the second one. And the system came back exactly, precisely, boringly correct, both times, and my house went away, and I've never had another one since. Here's the part I actually came to tell you. The airplanes were going home. Not straight home. They were heading for a point in the air where aircraft go to wait, a spot on the water agreed between the crews, the way you would agree to meet somebody at a particular bench in a park. That agreement happened on a frequency I was not on. I could not hear it. Nobody in my room could hear it. It was a conversation between people in cockpits about where they personally intended to be in a few minutes. The track came back. It came back at that point. I did what I am trained to do, which is say what I see, out loud, immediately, in plain words. I gave the bearing, and I gave the range. I heard my own voice do it, and my voice was fine. And the room went quiet. Not all at once. That is what I remember most exactly. 20 people stopped talking at slightly different moments, over about 2 seconds, so it sounded like a room emptying rather than a room going silent. A sentence stopped in the middle somewhere behind me. Somebody's chair. Then just the fans, which are always there and which you never hear until there is nothing else. Nobody said anything. Not one person in that room said one word. The telephone by my left elbow rang. It rang 4 or 5 times. Nobody picked it up, including me, and I was the person whose telephone it was. Then somebody coughed, and it started up again, all of it, the way a room does. Within a minute, there were 3 conversations going, and a man behind me was complaining about a watch bill. I sat there and worked the rest of my 5 hours and did every part of my job correctly, and I could not have told you afterwards what any of the rest of it was. I want to be clear that nothing happened. Nothing came at anybody. Nobody was hurt then or ever. It was the safest thing in the world. It was 20 people in a cold blue room not speaking, and a telephone ringing. And I have never in my life been anywhere as frightening as that. I went to write the time in the corner of the plexiglass, the way I had for 7 years, and I had squeezed the grease pencil hard enough to break it in half. I did not feel myself do it. There was green on the heel of my hand and green on my sleeve, and the sleeve had it for 2 days, because those coveralls did not come clean. It was waiting where they were going. The only place that had been said out loud was inside those airplanes. That is the sentence. I have never found a way to make it smaller. The watch supervisor came over eventually. He looked at my display for a while, and he said, "Log it." Then he went back to his clipboard. I do not blame him for that. I have thought about it for 20 years, and I think it was probably the only thing a sensible man could say. But I waited a long time for somebody in that room to be as unsettled as I was, and nobody ever was, and I still cannot decide whether that meant they knew something I did not, or whether they simply had somewhere else to be. When I came off watch, I went up. I almost never did that. I went out onto a weather deck and stood at the rail in the dark, and the sea was so flat it was not really doing anything, just breathing a little, and the air was warm, and there were more stars than there is any use for. I stood there about 10 minutes. I remember thinking that I had spent 5 hours in a freezing blue room being certain about the sky, and that the actual sky was right there, and I had not looked at it in 9 days. On the Sunday, I got 12 minutes on a satellite telephone, and I called my mother. She told me about a church supper and about my sister's kitchen taps. I said the food on board was better than last time. I did not say one word about any of it. I have thought about that quite a lot since, and I do not think I was keeping a secret. I think I did not have the sentences yet, and I was afraid that if I started, I would hear how it sounded. There was a recording. Somebody had a camera on one of the airplanes, the kind that sees heat, and it caught the thing for a little while. For about a month, that recording was something people at the squadron talked about. And then it was something people did not talk about. And then It was gone from my life entirely, and I assumed for years that it had been thrown away. 16 years later, I was standing in my kitchen in Virginia with the television on in the next room. I was not watching it. I was doing something at the sink, and the shape came up on the screen, not leaked, not sneaked out. Released, on purpose by the department I had worked for, with a written statement saying that the object in it remained unidentified. I sat down on a kitchen chair with a wet plate in my hand. My daughter came in and asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and I was, mostly. That is what I mean when I say the record did not help. It is all there. There's a video anybody in the world can watch. There's a paragraph from the government saying, in flat official English, that they do not know what it is. There are the logs, and my track number is in them somewhere, the number I wrote on the plexiglass in green pencil with my sleeve ready to wipe it off. Everything I saw is confirmed. Every bit of it. And confirmation, it turns out, is not the same as an answer. And I did not know that when I was 26. I still write the time on things, receipts, the back of my hand, the corner of a newspaper. My husband thinks it is a work habit that never came off, and it is also not. Maybe it was ours. Maybe it was something of ours being tested, and the people in the room with me knew, and the reason nobody was surprised is that surprise would have been a security problem. I have believed that on and off for 20 years, and most days I still think that is probably it. But somebody is going to have to explain to me how it knew where they were going. My headlights went yellow, and then brown, and then out, and about 11 minutes later they came back on by themselves. I hauled for a cotton gin. Trailers mostly and later modules out of the fields and into the yard, all night long in harvest, which is what everybody out there does in the autumn because the gin does not stop. My name is Otis. I was 38. This was Hockley County in West Texas, the night of the 2nd of November going into the 3rd in 1957. I will say what I saw, and you can do what you want with it. That autumn was a wet one, which is a nuisance in cotton. It had been raining off and on for 3 days, and there was a warm wind coming up out of the south, and thunder somewhere well off to the southeast with nothing under it. No lightning. I want to be particular about that, because of what got said afterwards. I sat in that truck all night looking at that sky, and there was no lightning in it anywhere. The Caliche side roads go to grease when they are wet. You learn to keep off the crown and out of the ruts, and you learn where every bad, low place is. And I knew that road. I had been over it something like 2,000 times. I could tell you where the washboard started by the sound the mirrors made. I had been awake about 19 hours. I will say that myself first, because it is the first thing anybody says back to me. The gin was dry, and so was I. I had a thermos and a can of peaches, and that was the whole of it. A gin in harvest is a thing you can hear from a quarter of a mile before you can see it. It is a steady roar with a knock in it, and there is lint hanging in the yard, lights like snow that will not come down, and everything for a mile smells of defoliant and diesel and green cotton. Our foreman was a man named Hoyle, who had not sat down since September. He would stand out in the yard in the middle of the night with a clipboard and wave you into a bay with 2 fingers, and if you were slow, he would wave with 1. I had 2 habits worth mentioning. One was a flashlight I kept under the seat with a bad switch in it. You had to slap it against the flat of your hand to make it come on, and then it would burn all night. I had been meaning to buy another one for 1.5 years. The other was the gin ticket. Every load, you get a ticket with the time stamped on it, and I would drop mine in the glove box instead of the shirt pocket because I've washed too many shirt pockets. There were probably 60 of them in there by November. Now, about 1 a.m, I was running empty out toward Witherall, which is 11 miles of not much, 1 yard light on the whole stretch, turn rows either side. The radio went first. not static, gone. The way a radio sounds when the aerial has fallen off, a kind of dead flat nothing, and the little orange light behind the dial went out with it. I reached over and turned the knob back and forth and got nothing at all, and I remember being irritated, because that radio was 6 months old. Then the lights. They went yellow, the way lights do when the generator quits, then brown. Then there was just the shape of the road in front of me, and then there was not even that. And at the same time, the engine started dropping cylinders. Not choking, not sputtering out of fuel, which sounds different and I've heard plenty. It went down one cylinder at a time, evenly, like somebody was pulling wires off in order, and by the time I had my foot off it, the thing was dead and rolling. I put it on the shoulder because it was that or the bar ditch, and I sat there in the dark with both hands still on the wheel. That is when I saw it. It was up the road ahead of me, 150 yards, about. I paced it off in daylight later, and it was 161. It was sitting on the blacktop, not beside it, on it, taking up more than a lane. The shape of an egg stood up on its small end, and I could not tell you what it was made of because it was putting out a light off itself that you could not look straight at, like the inside of a welding hood, that color. Only there was no crackle and no smell of it, and welding you can smell from a long way. The heat came next. Through the windshield, on my face and on the backs of my hands, the way it is when you stand a foot too close to a stove. It had been cool enough for a jacket all week. I had a jacket on. I got warm in that cab and I did not roll the window down, and I could not tell you why not. I went for the flashlight under the seat and I slapped it against my palm the way you do, and it would not light. I slapped it 4 or 5 times. Nothing. And I sat back up with it in my lap. There was no sound. That is the thing I would want somebody to write down, if anybody was ever going to write down the right things. That wind was still going. I could hear it in the weeds on the fence line, the same as it had been. And out of that thing there was nothing at all coming. No hum, no hiss, not a whisper. There were cattle in the pasture to my left, 100 head near enough. Every one of them was up, and every one of them was faced that way, and not one of them was making a noise. If you have ever been around cattle at 1 a.m, you know they are never quiet. They are quiet for about 4 seconds at a time, and then somebody says something. I sat there for a while, and I got a story going in my head, and the story was a wreck. A tank truck laid over in the road with a flare burning, or a rig with a bad load and a man out there needing help. And I liked that story quite a lot, and it got as far as my hand going to the door handle. Then it came up off the road. It did not lean first. Nothing leans up. A crane picks a thing up and the thing swings, and this did not do that. It just stood up off the blacktop, slow at first, and went up past the pole tops, and as it went the light came off it the way a bulb goes when you switch it. Bright, then orange, then a dull red coal, then nothing. And it was gone off north and there was nothing to look at anymore. And while it was still going, my truck started. The starter never turned. I want to be plain about that because it is the part I have never been able to hand to anybody. My key was in the on position where I had left it, and the starter did not crank, and the engine simply came back, all cylinders, at an idle, the same as if it had never quit. The dash lights came up. The headlights came on and lay out on the wet blacktop with the rain shining on it, and the radio came back in the middle of a word. It was the same song. It had not moved on. Whatever had been playing when it died was still playing, and it came in on the second half of a word. And I sat there in the road with the engine idling and both hands on the wheel, and I listened to the rest of that song, because I could not make myself put it in gear. I do not know what to do with that. I have had 68 years to do something with it, and I have not. I drove to the gin. I was not speeding. When I came in the office, there were 2 other drivers standing at the desk, and I knew both of them, and they had the same face on that I expect I had. One of them had been northeast of town. One of them had been out past the highway. Neither of them had seen me, and I had not seen them. I got home at about 3:15. Wanda was up, which she never was, on account of the wind rattling a loose piece of tin on the shed. She looked at me in the kitchen door and asked me what was the matter. And I said the truck had quit on me out toward Witherall, which was true as far as it went. She poured me a cup of coffee at 3 a.m, which tells you what my face was doing. I told her the rest of it about a week later, sitting at that same table, and she heard the whole thing through without saying anything, and then she said, "Well, that was all. Well," and she got up and did the dishes, and she believed me for 51 years and never once made me say it twice. The sheriff's office had a night of it. There were more calls than that from around the county, drivers mostly, and a couple of farm families. A deputy came out in the morning and took my name and got it a little wrong on the paper, wrote down Otis, and I did not correct him because I was tired and it did not seem important. He wanted the time. I gave him the time off the gin ticket out of the glove box, stamped to the minute. A few weeks later, a sergeant came through from the Air Force. He was polite. He was there for less than a day, I believe, for the whole county. The finding, when it came, was ball lightning. I want to be fair because I've been unfair about it before. Ball lightning is a real thing, and I am not a scientist. But there was no lightning that night. The sky was clear and settled for hours in every direction, and there were 15 of us or thereabouts spread over hours and miles, and every one of us had the same 3 items: lights out, engine dead, a light on the road. And it went in a file with a number on it, and the file said, "Ball Lightning." And the file is still there. You can read it. Anybody can read it. It has my name in it, spelled Otis. That is what gets me, if anything does. It is not that nobody wrote it down. Somebody wrote it all down, carefully, in the proper form, and put it where it would keep. It kept. It is 68 years old, and it is in perfect order, and it does not say one true thing about what was in that road. I put my copy in a drawer in the front room, and it is still in there with the deed and a pocket knife and my wife's reading glasses. I do not drive at night with the radio off. Not once since. My wife thought it was for company, and I let her think it, and it is for company, in a way. Maybe somebody knows exactly what that was, and it is not me and never will be. Maybe it was weather doing something nobody had a name for yet. That is probably it. I have seen a great deal of weather. I have never seen any that turned my lights off and then gave them back. There was warm water in that harbor that night, and there is no warm water in that harbor, not in October, not ever. I was 19. It was the south shore of Nova Scotia, down near Shag Harbor, and it was the 4th of October, 1967, about 11 at night. Doane is the name. Ambrose Doane. My Uncle Bert had a 38-foot boat, and that autumn he was letting me take her out on my own account, which was the whole of my ambition at that age. I had been on that water since I was 7 years old. I could stand on the wharf with my eyes shut and tell you every light along that shore and the count on each one, how many flashes and how long between. That is not bragging. Everybody there could do it. It is like knowing the way from your bed to the bathroom. I want to say early on that I was not the first to see it. I was the 4th or the 5th. There were people up and down that shore already at their windows before I ever came out of the door, and that is honestly the only part of the whole business that has ever made me feel any better about myself. My uncle taught me one thing that stuck harder than the rest. Before you do anything else in a boat, put your hand in the water, over the side, wrist deep, and hold it there a moment. He said, "It tells you what kind of day you have got." I do not know if that is true. I have done it every working day for 58 years. She was a Cape Islander, high in the bows and cut away aft, built up the shore by a man who was dead before I was born. Bert had owned her 19 years. She had a make and break in her when he got her and a proper diesel by the time I had her, and she would take a following sea better than anything else on that wharf, which matters more down there than speed does. I painted her that August, green to the rail and buff above it, because that is what color she had always been. It had been a poor autumn up to then. The herring were not where they were supposed to be and had not been for a fortnight, and the older men were arguing about it on the wharf every morning the way they argue about everything. There is always something not where it is supposed to be. That is fishing. Nobody thought anything of it at the time, and I would not have thought of it since. Except that afterwards everybody thought of it, and I do not put any weight on that at all. That night was flat calm, half a moon. The water was about 51 degrees, which sounds cold and is cold, and the air was colder than the water. So there was a bit of steam lying on the surface and under the point where it was sheltered. You could smell bait and diesel off the wharf and nothing else. I came out because somebody was shouting. There were 4 orange lights, low, out over the water going down the shore from the north, in a line, and they were in step. Whatever the spacing between them was, it stayed exactly that, and it stayed that the whole way down. And 4 separate things in the air do not do that. 4 separate things drift. These did not drift at all. Then the line tipped. All 4 together, forward, maybe 30 degrees, holding their spacing while they did it. It was the tipping that changed the night for everybody standing there, because up until then a person could tell himself it was aircraft, and after that a person could not. I will try to describe it, and I will not get there. What I could see was the lights, which were orange and steady, not flashing, not blinking. No red and no green anywhere. Between them and under them there was something, and I could not resolve it, and I've never been able to say whether that is because it was dark or because there was nothing there to resolve. It was big. That I know from the spacing. It was a good deal bigger than the church. Then there was a sound at last, and the sound was wrong. A whistle going down in pitch, the way a kettle does in reverse, and at the end of the whistle a slap, not a crash. I have heard a boat come off a sea and hit flat, and it is like a gunshot. And this was that sound, but wide, like a very large, flat thing being set down on the water on purpose by somebody who did not want to break it. Out where it went in there was a light under the surface, and it moved. It was not drifting on the tide, which I knew even at 19, because I knew what the tide was doing. It was going. For about 20 minutes after that, the whole harbour was certain it was an aeroplane, and I want to tell you what a comfort that was. An aeroplane is terrible, and an aeroplane is a thing you know what to do about. Men were pulling on boots. Somebody's mother came down with blankets over her arm, and somebody else had a thermos. We were on a rescue, and a rescue is a job, and a job is a floor you can stand on. I had my boat off the wharf inside 4 minutes, and I was not frightened at all. I was busy. There's a great deal of difference. Then the word came down that nothing was missing. No aircraft was late anywhere in the country. Nobody was overdue. There was no company waiting on a machine that had not come home, and no family waiting on anybody at all. And when they told us that on the water, the floor went out from under the whole thing. Because if there is nobody to save, then what exactly are you doing out here at midnight? 5 boats got out to where it went down. Somebody's light found the foam first. It was a strip of it, about 80 feet wide, running maybe half a mile, and it was pale yellow, and it was glowing. Not shining back at our lights. Glowing on its own account, a soft yellow, low, the way the water goes some nights with the little creatures in it, except it was not that, and every man out there had seen that 1,000 times and said so. We cut the engines, all 5 of us, one after another, without anybody saying to. And then there was nothing to do at all. I have thought about why we did that. Nobody gave an order. There was no reason to cut an engine in a search. You want to be able to move. I think it was that we had all arrived expecting to be busy, and there was nothing to be busy with. And a running engine in the middle of that felt like shouting in a church. I have been in some quiet places. I have never been anywhere as quiet as 5 boats sitting in that foam with the motors off. You could hear somebody's engine ticking as it cooled. You could hear a man breathing 2 boats over. There was no wreckage in it. There was no smell of fuel, and fuel on water you can smell before you can see. There was nothing floating in it. It was foam and light, and that was all. And I put my hand in the water, because that is what I do, and it was warm. Not warm like a bath, warm like the sea in August, which is not warm either, but it is nothing like 51 degrees, and I had put my hand in 51 degrees an hour before at the wharf. I took my hand out, I dried it on my leg. I did not put it back in. I did not say anything. I want to be honest about that too. There were older men out there and I was 19, and I did not fancy being the boy who said the water was warm. I found out about 11 years later, at a funeral, that 2 of them had done exactly the same thing and said nothing for the same reason. Here is the part I have never got settled. The tide was running hard to the southwest and had been for 2 hours. Everything runs southwest there on that tide. We had thrown things in it that night without thinking, a bit of rope, and it went southwest at a walking pace like everything else always does. That foam sat still for 40 minutes. Then it was gone. Not thinned out, not spread, not carried off in a long tail the way anything on that water goes. It was there, and then a man swung a light across, and it was not. And the water under it was black and ordinary, and there was nothing to show where it had been. I got in about 4:30 in the morning. My mother was sitting up in the kitchen with the oven door open for the heat. She had heard it on the party line before I was off the wharf, the way you did then. She gave me tea and she listened, and at the end of it she said that I was not to be talking about it at church. And I said no, and I did not, for about 9 years. She was not being unkind. It was a small place, and a person could get a name in a small place, and a young fellow trying to buy his own boat cannot afford a name. I understood it then, and I understand it better now. But I have thought since that if 24 sensible people all agree to be quiet about the same evening, then in about 30 years there will be no evening at all. And that is nearly what happened. A naval ship came. Divers worked the bottom for the better part of a week, and they came up with nothing, and I believe that, because I have known divers, and they are the worst liars in the world. The Mounties opened a file that night. A constable named Mercer came down to the wharf and asked every one of us the same 3 questions in the same order, and wrote it all in a book, and he was so calm about it that he was the most frightening thing on that wharf. That file went to Ottawa. It is in the National Archives now, with a number on it, and there are telegrams in there between one office and another, and if you go looking you will find that the official position, in the end, was that the object was unidentified. That is the truest sentence any government has ever written down, and it is no use to anybody. 60 years on, they have made a museum of it. There is a road sign, people come in the summer. My granddaughter took me to the museum, and I stood there and read our own night up on a board on the wall with dates and times. All correct, every bit of it correct, and I got out into the car park and had to stand for a minute. I still put my hand in the water before anything else. Every day. My son does it too, and I have never told him why. Maybe there is a plain answer, and the plain answer went to the bottom, and the mud took it. And it is sitting there yet under 30 feet of silt off Barrington Passage. That is probably the way of it. I have had my hand in that water twice a day for 58 years. It has never once been warm since. 200 children went quiet at the same moment, and I was the one standing in front of them. I taught junior science at a high school on the southeastern edge of Melbourne, out past Clayton, and this was the morning of the 6th of April, 1966. Judith is my name. I was 27 and 4 years out from England, and I could still hear my own vowels in a room full of Australian children. It was autumn there, which is a lovely thing, and nothing like autumn at home. Dry, bright, hard shadows, the smell of cut grass and eucalypt, and a sky with absolutely nothing in it. We were running athletics trials on the oval that morning. Heats, a whistle, a lot of shouting, girls in house colors. Beyond the fence there was a paddock, and beyond the paddock a stand of pines. And behind the pines the ground fell away into a gully. And all of that together was called the Grange, and the children were not supposed to go into any of it. I should say what I was, because it turns out to matter. I taught the astronomy unit. I had stood in front of those same children twice that year, and identified a weather balloon for them, correctly, both times, and been rather pleased with myself about it. I was the person in that paddock whose job it was to know what was in the sky. I taught in a low brick block on the far side of the quadrangle, with gas taps along the benches and a cupboard of glassware that was mostly chipped. There was a woman called Ellen Frayne, who taught the other half of the junior science, and who had been there 11 years and knew where everything was. We had a standing arrangement that whichever of us was on yard duty would take the other one's marking for an hour. That is the kind of morning it was supposed to be. Yard duty, heats, marking, a cup of tea at 12:30. I had a stopwatch on a lanyard round my neck for the heats. I started it. That is the whole of my contribution to the historical record, and I did it out of pure habit, before I had any idea I was doing anything at all. A girl in the second heat stopped running. That is what I noticed first. Not the sky, a child stopping halfway down the straight, which in a race is the strangest thing you can see. She stopped and she looked up over the pines, and then the rest of her heat stopped, one after another, and then everybody stopped. And my thumb went down on the watch because when children stop running, you time it. It was over the paddock beyond the fence, and it was low. Not high up and far away, low and near, gray, gray-white, gray. I have said it 3 ways for 50 years, and I still do not think I have said it. It had the shape of 2 saucers put together face to face, and it did not shine exactly, and it did not glow. It was a dull sort of metal color, with the morning on it. I held my hand out at arm's length with my thumb up, which is what you do, and there was a great deal of it either side of my thumb. It was not making any noise. We were perhaps 150 yards from it on a still morning. The loudest thing in that paddock was a child crying somewhere behind me, and after a while a magpie. Then it went down behind the pines, into the gully, and stayed down. That is when it became an event rather than a sight, because 200 children began walking towards the fence. All of them at the same speed, at the same time, quite calmly. There was nothing hysterical about it. It was more frightening than hysteria would have been. I had to get out in front of them and put my arms out and use my working voice, and I did. And they stopped at the fence in a rough line, and that is the moment. 11 minutes past 11. 200 children standing absolutely silent along a fence in autumn sun, every one of them facing the same way, and me in front of them with one hand up and nothing whatsoever to say. I have taught for 38 years. I have never been in a place that quiet with that many people in it. There was a girl crying. I want to put her in properly, because she has been a footnote for 60 years, and she was a person. She was in the first form, and she was not frightened of the thing in the paddock. I asked her later, and she was quite firm about it. She was crying because everybody had gone quiet, and she could not work out what was wrong with everyone. and she thought something had happened that she had missed. I have never forgotten that. The only person crying in that paddock was crying about the silence. It came back up out of the gully after a time. Slowly at first, and then not slowly at all, and it went over the school and away to the northeast, and there were aeroplanes with it. Small ones, light aircraft, 5 of them, and they were behind it and below it, and they were not gaining on it. I remember thinking, quite clearly, well, at least somebody official is dealing with this, and then thinking, those are not official airplanes, those are Cessnas. Our groundsman went on rolling the cricket square through the whole of it. I could see him over the handle of the roller the entire time, head down, walking his lines. Afterwards, I asked him. He said he had seen it. I asked him why on earth he had kept rolling, and he looked at me the way you look at a person who has asked a silly question, and he said he had the square to do. Then the bell went, and we took them all inside, and for about 90 minutes the day was simply a day. I taught a first-form class about the periodic table. I remember it as being one of the better lessons I gave that year, which is a peculiar thing to remember. And underneath it, I was quietly happy, because I had decided it would be in the evening paper with a name attached to it. Some aircraft I had not heard of, something being trialed out of one of the aerodromes, and that I would feel very silly indeed at tea time. And I was rather looking forward to feeling silly. I held that pleasant feeling for an hour and a half. At lunch, 2 of the older boys came and found me, and said there was a mark in the paddock, and there was. There was a ring in the grass, perhaps 25 or 30 feet across. The grass was pressed down flat, and it was pressed in a circle, all of it lying the same way round, clockwise like hair-combed. It was not burnt. I want to be very clear about that because burnt is what everybody wants it to have been. It was not scorched, and it did not smell of anything, and there was no mark on the soil. And the grass inside the ring was dry. There had been a heavy dew. The whole of that paddock was still wet at 11 in the morning. My shoes were wet walking to it, and my stockings were wet at the ankle. Inside that ring it was dry as a road. I am a science teacher, and I stood in a dry circle in a wet paddock, and I did not have one single sensible thought. I did try. I have always tried. It is a habit and not a virtue. I thought about heat, and there was no heat, because grass that has been dried by heat looks dried, and this looked pressed. I thought about the wind, and there had been no wind. I thought about the boys themselves, because boys do things, and I looked at the way that grass was lying, and I knew that no child at that school had done it, and I could not tell you why I knew. It was too even. Everything people do is a bit uneven, and this was not. The ring was gone within about 3 weeks. Grass comes back up. That is the ordinary and slightly cruel thing about grass. Men came over the next few days and looked at it. I do not know who they were. Some of them were in uniform and some were not, and none of them spoke to me, and none of them, so far as I know, spoke to any member of staff about what they found, and we were told that the matter was best not discussed with the students. I want to be careful here, because this gets told as something much bigger than it was. Nobody frightened me. Nobody threatened anybody. I could not tell you today who said it, or whether it came from the department or the headmaster, or simply from the air the way things do in schools. It was a sentence that arrived, and then everybody behaved as though it had always been there. Within a fortnight, it was not a thing that was talked about, and within a term, it was not a thing that had happened. Ellen took my marking that afternoon without being asked. She did not say anything about it, then or ever, except once, years later, at somebody's retirement, when she said, quite lightly, over a glass of sherry, that she had watched me come in off that oval and that I had gone the color of the wall. And then she changed the subject, and I let her. and I have wished ever since that I had not let her. There was a piece in the paper, 3 inches of it, further back than you would think. The Air Force noted the day and, in effect, found nothing of interest. And then 30 years of nothing at all. It is a record, now, of a sort. There is a paragraph in a local history collection. There are 2 or 3 photographs of the paddock. There is a documentary, which is very good, and which I have watched twice. There are 200 people who are in their 70s and 80s and who all remember it, and who cannot agree on how many objects there were, and I have listened to them argue about it in a school hall with a projector going, and every one of them is telling the truth as far as I can tell. That is the whole of the evidence. 200 honest people, a ring in a paddock that has not existed for 40 years, and 3 inches of newspaper. And the odd thing, the thing I did not expect at all, is that being believed has not helped either. I am believed now. I have been believed for about 15 years. People are terribly kind and they nod and they say, "How extraordinary." And then we all have another cup of tea. And I'm exactly where I was standing at 11 minutes past 11 on the 6th of April, with my hand up, not knowing. I still start a stopwatch when I do not know what I am looking at. I am aware that is an odd thing for a woman of 87 to be doing. Maybe it was something experimental, and somebody's grandchildren know exactly what it was, and it is in a book somewhere that I have not read. That is probably it. That is very probably it. 20 minutes. That is how long it was, near enough. And I have the number because I put my thumb on a watch without thinking. Nobody has ever once asked me for the number. The stars went out one at a time along a line, and then they came back on in the same order behind it. My name is Merritt, and I cleaned a high school for 22 years. Floors, mostly. Gymnasium floors, which are a science all their own. I lived up in Prescott Valley in Arizona, in a house at the end of a gravel drive with a good dark yard, and this was the evening of the 13th of March, 1997. I am going to take a minute getting to it. I apologize in advance. People tell me I take too long, and then they tell me the long part was the good part, so I have stopped apologizing. And there, I have apologized again. There was a comet that spring. The best one anybody my age had ever had. It came up in the northwest in the evening, and it had 2 tails on it if you had a dark sky, and half the state of Arizona was standing outside after supper looking at it for about 6 weeks. That is important. Everybody was outside. Everybody was looking up. That has never happened before or since in my lifetime, and it happened to be happening that particular night. I had a folding chair with a strip of duct tape holding one leg on. I had a thermos of coffee, and I had a star chart I had photocopied at the library, folded in quarters, with the comet's position for that week circled in pencil. I knew the sky. I want to put that on the table plain, because everything after it depends on it. I could tell you what was up that month and where it would be at 9 o'clock, and where it would have got to by 11. I could tell a landing light from a strobe, from a satellite, from a meteor, and I had been doing it since I was a boy with a library book. I am not the man who calls the police about Venus. I have talked 2 separate people out of calling the police about Venus, one of them my own brother. I will tell you the rest of it since I am telling it. My wife and I came apart in '92, and she took the good coffee pot and I got the house, which was more than fair. And after that the house was quiet in a way I never did get used to. So I was outside a lot. That is really all the yard chair was, a man with too much evening. The school I cleaned had a gym floor I had put down myself, 3 coats, and I could tell you which board in it was going to complain in July when the humidity came. 22 years. There's a plaque with my name on it in that gymnasium now, which they did without asking me, and which I did not much care for and have never once mentioned to anybody until this minute. I have another habit, and it is going to come up. I count seconds between things, mostly out loud and quiet, the way you do at a level crossing. It is a nervous thing. My wife used to hate it. It was about 8:30 and cold in the way the desert is cold. Dry cold, where your hands go before your face does. I was in the chair with the chart in my lap. They came up out of the northwest. 5 lights, amber, in a shallow V. Not a tight V, a wide, lazy one, like geese that have given up on the formation a little. And they were not blinking. That is the first thing that was wrong, and it is not a small thing. Everything in that sky blinks. An airliner has a red one and a green one and a white strobe that goes off every 1.5 seconds like a camera. A helicopter is worse. Even the satellites will tumble and flare on you. These 5 were steady, plain amber, and they had been steady from the moment I picked them up. So I started counting, because that is what I do. And the spacing held, that is the second thing. I want to explain why it matters, because it is not obvious unless you have watched a lot of airplanes. Aircraft in formation breathe. They creep in and drift out a little, constantly, because a man is flying each one and no man holds a station perfectly for 2 minutes. Over a couple of minutes the gaps change and you can see it if you are patient. These did not breathe, not once. Whatever the gaps were when I picked them up in the northwest, those were the gaps when they went over the top of my house, and I watched them for a good while in between. I built myself an explanation in there, and I want to be honest and tell you about it, because I liked it very much. 5 airplanes in trail, out of one of the bases to the south. An inversion layer doing something odd to the sound, which does happen. I have heard of it happening. And the dark between the lights being nothing at all, just night. Just the ordinary black sky I have been looking at my whole life. I said it out loud to nobody. I remember feeling pleased. It lasted about 40 seconds, because then the stars started going out on the wrong side of the lights. Here is what I mean, and I have never found a better way to say it. There is a star, and then there is no star, and it is not fading and it is not twinkling out. It is there, and then it is covered. And then the one next to it goes, and then the next. In order, along a line the way a hand goes across a page when you cover up an answer. And then behind, on the other side, they come back in the same order. I put my hand up. Arm straight out, fingers spread the way you measure. And the dark part was wider than my hand. And it was still coming. I got out of the chair at some point. I do not remember doing it. I was standing in the gravel with the chart in my fist and my head back. There was no sound, none. I want to be very exact about this, because it is the part that people slide past. It was not quiet. It was not distant. There was a dog 3 houses down barking at something, and I could hear its collar tags rattling. I could hear that, and there was a thing between me and the stars that was bigger across than the block I lived on, and it was making no noise at all. A car went by on the road below the house while it was overhead, doing about 30. It did not slow down. I watched its taillights go all the way to the corner and turn. And I have thought about that man a great deal over the years, and I hope he is well. I could see stars through the gaps between the lights, right up until the leading edge of the dark, and then I could not. And then I could again behind it. Whatever that was had an edge, and the edge was a long way outside any of its lights. That is my sentence. I have got it down to that, and it took me about 10 years. I counted. I got past 60 before the trailing edge cleared my roofline. More than a minute of something passing over a house without a sound. When it was gone, I sat back down in the chair, and I found I had folded that star chart into eighths, which is 1 fold past where a paper wants to go. and I have no memory of doing it, and I still have it, folded into eighths. I called my sister Corva in Cottonwood about 20 minutes after. She had been out too, looking at the comet with her husband, and she had seen it, and she was in the middle of telling me about it before I got a word in. We talked about 11 minutes. Neither of us used the word that everybody uses. We just described it to each other, twice each, checking the way you check a phone number. Then I called my brother Dwight, and Dwight said it was airplanes, and Dwight has said it was airplanes every Thanksgiving since. I do not mind. He is a good brother. He was not outside, now. Here is where it gets to be about the record, which is what I actually want to tell you about. That night was not a secret for 1 single minute. Thousands of people called. The switchboards went down. There were people with video cameras on their roofs because of the comet, and some of them turned around and filmed it. It ran in the newspapers for weeks. It was on national television. It has been on national television about once a year ever since. Some months after, an explanation came out. Flares. Illumination flares. Dropped by aircraft over a gunnery range to the southwest, which drift and burn and go out one by one and hang in a line as they do it. I want to be fair to that explanation because I have not always been. Those flares are real. They were dropped. It is in the record, and it is not in dispute, and I have seen the film of them, and, do you know, they do look like a line of lights hanging in the sky, and I would not want to be the man arguing with a person who saw those and thought they had seen something else. They were dropped at 10 o'clock at night. The thing that went over my house went over at about 8:30, and it did not hang, and it did not drift, and it did not go out one at a time, and it had an edge that put out the stars. Those are two different things about 90 minutes apart, and for going on 30 years now, people have been arguing very loudly about the second one, and hardly anybody has ever asked me about the first. Then the governor of the state held a press conference about it that summer, and made a joke of it, brought a fellow out in a costume. Everybody laughed, and it was in all the papers, and that was that. And 10 years after, the same man stood up in public and said that he had been outside that night himself, and that he had seen it, and that it was not aircraft, and that he had made the joke because he had a state to keep calm. Both of those things are in the record. They sit there next to one another, in the same file, under the same date, and neither of them cancels the other. And I have made my peace with that, although it took a while. You want to know what that has been like? It has been like this. Everything I saw is confirmed by 10,000 people, and there is an official answer, and the official answer is about a different hour of the same night, and no one has ever had to reconcile the two because there is no one whose job that is. A reporter telephoned me once, about 2 years after. Young fellow, polite, taking names off a list somebody had given him. He asked me good questions for 11 minutes and he wrote things down. I could hear the pen. He said he would call back the following week. I am not bitter about it. He probably had 40 of us on that list and about 9 inches of column to put us in. But I sat by that telephone the following Wednesday evening like a fool, with the folded chart on the table, and it never rang. And that is the closest I have ever come to being asked properly. I still know what the sky is supposed to be doing on any given night. I check. I am 73, and I go out in the yard in a coat and I check. Maybe there were 2 different things over Arizona that night, and everybody has spent 30 years arguing about the wrong one. That is probably it. That is what I would put money on if you made me. I counted more than 60 seconds of something going over my house without making a sound. That is not on anybody's list. The unknown was the same size on my display as the airplane it was following. I worked traffic at the en route center in Anchorage. Not the tower, not the airport. The big, dim room that owns the sky over the whole interior, where the airplanes are little and green and 8 miles up and you never see one in your life. This was the evening of the 17th of November, 1986. My name is Noreen. I was 34 and 6 years in that room. I am going to give you the words I actually used where I can remember them, and then say what they meant, because otherwise none of it makes sense. November in Anchorage is dark at 4:30 in the afternoon, and it stays dark. It was 15 below outside. Inside it was warm and dim, and it hummed, rows of scopes, everybody in their own little pool of green light with their own strip bay beside them. There was a pot of coffee at the back that had been made by somebody on the day shift and nobody would admit to. The traffic that time of evening is mostly freight. Big airplanes coming over the pole from Europe with cargo, dropping down through Alaska on their way to Asia. And they are a pleasure to work because the crews are professionals, and there are not very many of them, and nobody is in a hurry. I want to say one thing about myself first. In 6 years in that room, I had never once put a pilot report of unusual traffic into the record. Not once. Other people did, occasionally, and I will be honest and tell you that I thought a little less of them for it. I thought it was a way of getting attention in a job where nothing much ever happens to you personally. I had come up from Duluth at 26 for the money and stayed for the work. There was a night in my second winter when a snowstorm took an approach down and the whole thing went to handoff procedure for about 2 hours. Everybody talking to everybody. No automation. Strips going hand to hand down the road like a bucket line. I loved it. That is a strange thing to love, and I am aware of it. But it is why I say what I say next. I am not a person who gets rattled by a busy sky. 2 things about how the room works, because both of them come back. The first is the strips. Every airplane gets a cardboard strip in a bay beside your scope, and you mark it up in pencil as you go. Clearances, altitudes, times in the corner. It is a paper record made by hand while the thing is happening, which is a very old way of doing business and, as it turns out, an excellent one. The second is the tape. Everything set on a control frequency is recorded, all the time, automatically, and has been for many years. You stop noticing about a week into the job, but it means that everything I said that evening exists in my own voice, and I want you to keep that in your mind, because it is the whole of the story. The freighter checked in with me somewhere over the interior, heading south. After a while, the crew came on and said, in careful English, that they had traffic in sight. Lights ahead of them and off to their left. And had we anything on it? I looked, and I had nothing, and I told them so. I said, negative traffic in that position. I want to be clear that I did not disbelieve them. That is not how it works. A crew tells you what they see, and you go and look, and if you have not got it, you say you have not got it, and everybody carries on. Pilots see lights all the time. Half of them are other aeroplanes 80 miles further away than they look, and the other half are Venus. Then I got a return. Primary, which means no transponder, no little box answering, just raw energy coming back off something. It was near where they said. It came and went, the way primaries do, and it stayed near them. So I started offering. This is the part of the job I was good at, and it is the part I am proudest of, and it is also the part that ruined the whole thing for me. When a crew is uncomfortable, you give them outs. I offered them a turn. They took it 20 degrees right, and I watched, and the return went with them and held its position. I offered them a further turn. Same thing. I offered them a descent. They took a descent, 4,000 feet of it, and the return came down too, and stayed exactly where it had been relative to the airplane the entire time. At some point I asked them if they wanted to go around in a circle, a full 360, which is not a thing you normally suggest to a freighter with a schedule. They said yes. They went round, it went round with them. The description is the hard part, and I am not going to be able to do it. On a display, a return is not a shape, it is a mark. What I can tell you is what it did and did not do. It did not have a transponder. It never squawked anything. It did not have a track that made sense over time. It did not come from anywhere, and it was not going anywhere. And it kept a position on that airplane through 4 maneuvers like it was tied on with string. What I cannot get over still is the crew's voices. 50 minutes, near enough, of the flattest, most correct radio you have ever heard. No stress in it at all. If you played you the tape without telling you anything, you would think it was a completely ordinary evening and 2 very tired men. The only reason you can tell anything at all is happening is the things they are asking for. That is professionalism. And it is also, I think, 3 people being frightened together, and none of them wanting to be the one who said it out loud. The controller at the next scope leaned over at one point. He looked at my display for about 4 seconds. He said, "Huh," and he went back to his own traffic. He was a good controller. I asked him about it 15 years later at somebody's retirement, and he did not remember any of it. Not the night, not the aeroplane, nothing. That is not a criticism of him. Most nights in that room disappear. Somewhere in there the return broke up, and the crew said the lights had gone, and I had about 10 minutes of ordinary. I worked a company flight through my sector. I got up and poured the terrible coffee. My shoulders came down off my ears, and I distinctly remember thinking the words, "Well, that's that." I have thought since that those 10 minutes were the worst thing that happened to me that night because they gave me the whole thing back and then took it away again. And the second time you have no floor at all. They called again. It was there again, I had it again, and that was when I actually looked at it. Not at where it was, at what it was. On my display, the unknown mark and the mark that was a 747 were the same size. I knew exactly what size a loaded 747 made on that equipment, because I had been looking at them every working day for 6 years. And I sat in that chair, in the dark, with my hand on a pencil, looking at 2 marks that were the same size, and only one of them was an airplane. I did not say a word about it on the frequency. There was no reason to, and it would not have helped anybody. You do not hand a crew a thing they cannot do anything about. That is not kindness, it is the job, but it is also kindness. I wrote it on the strip, in the corner, in pencil, with the time. And I said the number out loud to myself, the way you do to make a thing be real. And my own voice sounded wrong to me in my own head. That is the moment I would take back if I could take one back. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened, nobody was hurt, the airplane landed, everybody went home. Just because I have been carrying that 1 second around for 40 years, and it is heavier than it has any right to be. I went out to the car at the end of the shift and it was 20 below by then, and the door seal had frozen, and I had to put a foot on the sill and pull. I sat there while it warmed up and I did not turn the radio on. I remember the windscreen going from white to clear from the middle outwards, and watching that happen, and being aware that I was watching it so that I did not have to think about anything. My supervisor that night was a man called Terhune who was decent about the whole business, and stayed decent about it for years, which I did not appreciate properly at the time. There was another one, later, on a different watch, who used to do a little hum of the theme from a spooky television program when I walked past. 2 years of that. It is not a tragedy, but I stopped mentioning it in that building, and then I stopped mentioning it anywhere, and that is how a thing gets buried. Not by anybody powerful, just by somebody humming. Now the record. This is why I agreed to tell it. I did all the paperwork that night. I filled in every form there was, and I filled it in properly. Somebody came and pulled the strips and the tapes and the radar data, all of it, and that is exactly what should have happened. 2 men from the agency came up and interviewed me some weeks later. They were polite and thorough, and they took a long time, and they did not laugh at me once. I have no complaint about any person in this story. The report came out the following March. It confirms the sequence of events. It says an unidentified return was present in the vicinity of the airplane. It does not say what it was. And then, in the way these things go, the file said one thing in one place and something a little different in another, and a suggestion was raised that the return might have been a split image of the airplane itself. And that suggestion also sits in there, and so does the fact that the people who raised it were not certain either. All of it is in there. Nothing has been taken out. The word that ended up attached to it in the end was unexplained. And then years later, all of it went public. The whole thing. The voice tapes, the transcripts, the radar plots, hundreds and hundreds of pages, scanned and put on the internet where anybody in the world can sit down with a cup of tea and read it. You can listen to me. That is the part I did not expect. Anyone can go and listen to a 34-year-old woman say Roger at 5 in the evening in 1986. I have done it twice, once about 10 years ago and once last winter. My voice is higher than I remember it. It does not help. That is what I want people to understand. It is all there, and it is all correct, and it explains nothing at all. I still say everything out loud. At work I did it because it was recorded, and I wanted the record right. Now, I am retired, and I still narrate my own kitchen, and my daughter thinks it is very funny. Maybe it was an artifact in the equipment, and a coincidence, and 2 tired men over a very dark part of the world. That is probably it. I would say probably. Go and read it tonight if you like, every word. And when you have finished, you will know exactly as much as I do, which is nothing. There were stars right up to the edge of it, and there were no stars at all inside it. I had 11 minutes on the oven. That is the whole clock of this story, and I would like you to hold on to it because everything that happened inside 11 minutes. And at the end of them I went in and took out the bread. Kirchhoff. Alois. I was 51. And I was the 3rd baker in my family in that shop, in Eupen, which is in the German-speaking corner of Belgium, up against the border where nobody very much comes. This was the night of the 29th of November, 1989, going into the 30th. I started at 1:30 in the morning, the same as my father, the same as his father. 3-deck oven, gas, with steam. The shop was warm, and the alley behind it was not. I will tell you the temperature of things as I go, because that is how I think. The oven at 230, the dough at 24 when it goes in. The air in the alley that night about -2 and dry with frost on the vans. Behind the shop there is an alley, and then a bit of open ground, and then the road that goes up out of the town toward the dam. And past the dam there is the reservoir. And past the reservoir there is nothing at all except forest and water and then Germany. I went out into that alley at about 5 in the morning every working night for 26 years. To cool off. To have 4 minutes. I knew that sky better than I knew my own sitting room. And I am not being clever when I say that. It is simply arithmetic. I looked at that piece of sky about 7,000 times, and at my own ceiling maybe twice a year on a bad night. I knew every light on that road. I knew the aeroplanes that went over toward the east and what time they came. There was a helicopter that went along the dam on Thursdays, and I could have told you the hour. A bake is a series of small, unforgivable moments. The dough does not care that you are tired. It comes up when it comes up, and it goes in when it is ready, and it comes out when it is done. And if you are 11 minutes late for any of those, you have thrown away 4 hours of work and a morning's takings. My father used to say that a baker is a man who has arranged his whole life around not being late for something that cannot speak. I set the timer by feel. It is a wind-up dial, and after 26 years your hand knows 11 minutes. That night it was the second bake, the one that goes out to the 2 shops in the town and to the school. 60-odd loaves. In the shop behind me, the proving cabinet was ticking over and the radio was on low, the way I always had it, a station out of Cologne that played nothing much at that hour. I went out, and there was light in the alley from the wrong direction. That is a small thing to build a night on, but it is what happened. The street lamp is at the mouth of the alley to my left, and it puts my shadow along the wall in a particular way, and my shadow was lying the other way, over my right shoulder, coming from behind the roofs, from out over the open ground. I turned round. It was out over the road toward the dam, and it was low. 300 meters, perhaps. I have paced that ground since, and I would say 300, maybe a little less. It was a triangle. 3 white lights, 1 at each corner, and they were not small, each one about like a headlamp seen from close, but not a beam, not going anywhere, just there. And in the middle underneath, a red one, pulsing, slowly, slower than a heart. And between them it was solid. That is what I have never been able to hand to anybody in 36 years. The dark between those lights was not sky. There were stars all round it, perfectly good stars, a clear cold night. And inside the triangle there was nothing. No star, not one, right up to a hard edge, and along that edge the stars started again immediately. Whatever was between those lamps, it was a thing, and it was between me and the sky. And then it stopped. Not slowed, stopped, and hung there, over the road, absolutely still, and I am standing in a frozen alley in an apron with flour on my forearms looking at a stopped thing the size of the football ground. There was no sound. I want to be very clear about that because in the newspapers afterward everybody said no sound and it becomes a phrase, and phrases stop meaning anything. So, 300 meters. At 300 meters you hear a tractor. At 300 meters you hear a moped, plainly, and you know which moped. Behind me in the alley I could hear the frost on a van roof making that little tick it makes, which is a sound you have to be somewhere very quiet to hear at all. And in front of me was that. Then a police car came up the road from the town. Slowly. Not with any lights on, it came along the road toward the dam, and about level with the thing it stopped, in the middle of the carriageway, which is not where you stop a car. And nobody got out. I could see the 2 shapes in it. They sat there, I stood there, and the strangest part of that whole night, and I have said this to my wife and she thinks I am mad, is how polite it all was. Nobody did anything. It was like 3 people waiting for a 4th. While I was standing there, I got a reasonable thought, and I want to give it its due, because it was a good reasonable thought, and it lasted about 90 seconds. It is a machine, I thought. Somebody's machine, being tried out. And of course you try a machine like that at 5 in the morning near a border where nobody is awake, and of course you keep it quiet. And in a few years there will be a photograph of it in a magazine, and we will all feel foolish. I liked that so much that I folded my arms and leaned back against the door frame. I was leaning on the door frame when it began to move. It went off toward the reservoir, unhurried, and as it came clear of the trees it put down 2 beams. White ones, pale, going down onto the water. Not searchlights sweeping about, steady, wide, like 2 columns. And in the middle of each column there was a red point of light that went down, all the way down toward the water and then came back up. I watched that happen twice, and behind me in the shop the timer went off. I stood there 4 more seconds. I have counted them since in bed, many times 4, and then I went inside and opened the oven and took out the bread, because it was bread, and because in 11 minutes it would have been charcoal, and because I am a baker and that is what a baker's hands do when a bell rings. I have never been sure whether that was good sense or cowardice. My wife says sense. My son says cowardice, but he says it laughing. I think it was neither, and that it was simply what I was, and that a person mostly does what he is, especially at 5 in the morning. By the time I got back out with the trays racked, it was gone. There was the road, and the police car had gone too, and there was frost, and the sky was exactly the sky. Trudy came down at 7 and I did not tell her. I gave her coffee and I stood at the bench doing the rolls, and I said nothing at all for about 40 minutes, which she noticed, because in a marriage of that length a silence is as loud as a shout. She asked me twice. The second time I told her, all of it, with my hands still working, and she listened. And then she said that I should eat something, and that I had gone gray. That was her whole verdict, and I have never needed another one. The 2 policemen came into the shop that spring, separately, months apart, both of them off duty and in ordinary clothes, and both of them bought bread from me, and I served them, and I never once asked. I have thought about that a great deal. I could have asked. It would have taken 9 words. I think I did not ask because I did not want to be told that they had seen something smaller than what I saw. By 9 that morning, half the town had seen something. I want to say what the record looks like, because this is where the whole thing turns. 2 policemen filed a report. Ordinary policemen doing the ordinary thing, writing down what they had seen on their shift. And then it did not stop. Through that winter and into the spring, there were thousands of reports across the country. Thousands from farmers and school teachers and lorry drivers, and again from police. There was a proper scientific society that collected them and studied them, and the authorities did not sneer at it, which surprised everybody. And then, at the end of March, there was the night with the fighters. 2 of ours went up after something the ground radar had, and they got their radar to lock onto it, more than once, over more than an hour, and every time it moved in a way the men reading the tapes afterward could not account for, and the Air Force did not hide it. They released the data. They stood up in front of the press with charts, and they explained in detail, at length, that they were unable to explain it. I have always thought that was the most Belgian thing that has ever happened, and I say that with love. So, 13,000 people, police reports, military radar tapes, a press conference, books, a national study. It is, they tell me, the best documented thing of its kind that has ever happened in Europe. A young woman came from a newspaper in Brussels that January and sat at the corner table with a notebook and let her coffee go cold. She was serious and she asked good questions and she got every one of my answers down properly. The piece came out with my name in it and a photograph of the alley with the vans in it. And for about a fortnight, people I had sold bread to for 20 years looked at me a little differently, some of them kindly and 1 or 2 of them not. And I know exactly what I knew at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of November, 1989, which is that something with corners hung over the road to the dam and made no noise. The bread that morning was fine, by the way, perfectly good bread. I sold all of it. I still go out into that alley at the same point in every bake. My son has the shop now, and he thinks the whole business is a joke. And he lets me come in and do the early hours because I cannot sleep past 1 anyway. I go out. And I look up first before I look at anything else. 36 years. Maybe it was one of ours or one of the Americans, and in 50 years there will be one in a museum with a little card beside it, and school children will walk past it on the way to the aeroplanes. That is probably it. I would like to live long enough to see the card, mostly so that I can stop wondering. I stood in a doorway 3.5 miles from a light the size of a house, and I listened for the engine underneath it, and there was not one. I ran the answering service. That was my job for 11 years, in Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania, a cord switchboard in a back room off a hardware store, taking calls for a volunteer fire company, and about a dozen local businesses that could not afford a girl of their own. My name is Lorene. I was 41. This was the 9th of December, 1965. I am going to give you times all the way through. I apologize. For 30 years, my whole job was writing down what time a thing happened, and it never came off. The room had a wood stove, a wall clock, a window that looked at a brick wall, and the board. Emil Sobek owned the hardware store in front, and he was a good man, and he let me keep the stove going all winter with his own coal, which he never once mentioned. 2 habits. Both matter. I wrote the time first. Before the name, before the message, before anything. The time went at the top left of the slip, and then everything else. That was drummed into me by the woman who trained me, who had been on a board since 1929, and the pad had carbons. Top sheet went to whoever it was for. The carbon stayed in the book. The books stayed in a box. I want to say one thing before we get to it. I had taken the calls for 2 bad house fires and for an accident at a mine. I knew, from the ring rate alone, before I picked up a single one, the difference between a town that is excited and a town that is frightened. And in 11 years, I never once wrote a word on a pad that somebody had not said to me. You should know how a board like that feels, because it is nothing like a telephone. It is a wall of little brass holes with a lamp above each one, and a shelf of cords in front of you in pairs. And when a lamp comes up, you take a cord and put it in the hole and say the name of whoever it is you are answering for. Your hands learn it. After about a year, you stop looking. I could take 4 calls and hold 2 and never take my eyes off the clock. The fire company had its own ring cadence, and I could tell it from the others in my sleep, and once or twice actually did, because I dozed on that stool more nights than I would want written down. It started at about 10 minutes to 5 in the evening. Every lamp on that board came up at once, not one after another, together, like somebody had leaned on it. And for 20 minutes it was almost fun. It was a fireball. People had seen a fireball go over, and it turned out later that people had seen it in 6 states and in Canada, and they were calling because it was the most exciting thing that had happened to them in years. They wanted to tell somebody. Half of them did not even want the fire company. They just wanted a person on the end of a line. I remember laughing with a woman from out on the pike who said she had thought it was the Russians and had gone and stood behind her own car. At about 20 past 5, a woman called from a farm outside the village. She said there was something down in the woods behind her place. She said it was smoking, and she said, and I wrote this down, and I have the carbon, and it says this. She said it did not sound like a plane. The fire company went out. I toned them, and they went, and for a while it was an ordinary call, and I sat and did the crossword between lights. Then the traffic changed. That is the only way I can put it. Up until about 6:30, the calls were neighbors, voices I knew. After about 6:30, the voices were people I did not know, and they were shorter and flatter, and they did not give names, and they were not asking me things. They were telling me things. Which line to keep clear. That so-and-so would be calling. That the road up past the church would be closed. And that is what was wrong with the whole night, and it took me years to be able to say it plainly. 11 years on that board, and I'd never had a night with that much traffic and that few questions. Nobody asked me anything. Everybody told me things. And that is backwards, because a switchboard is a place people ask, and it went on being backwards for 4 hours. Emil came in at 8 to fetch a ledger out of the desk. He looked at that board with every lamp on it lit up, and he said, "Busy." And he took his ledger and went home to his supper. Round about 8:30 there was a lull. I got up and put wood in the stove, and I stood there a minute with my back to it, and I thought, well, it will have been a meteorite. I liked that word, I could spell it. It was in the papers whenever anything of the sort happened, and it had the great advantage of being a thing that had already happened, past tense, over with, nothing to be done. I sat back down with a fresh cup, and the board lit again, all of it, and this time it was trucks. Trucks on the road out toward the woods. Trucks that people were calling in about because they had never seen so many go by in the dark. Somebody said army. Somebody else said no, they were not army, they were just trucks. I wrote down what each person said, and only what each person said, because that is the job. At about 9, I went out for air. The fire hall was 40 yards from my door, and there was nobody in it, because they were all out. I stood in the open doorway with my cardigan pulled round me, and I looked northeast toward the pines, which are, as the crow flies, about 3.5 miles. There was a light over them, not a glow like a fire. I have watched a barn burn from 4 miles, and that is orange, and it moves, and it makes a dirty sky above it. This was white. The white you get off a welding arc, which I knew because my husband Stan worked at the glass plant, and there was always somebody welding something. Steady, not flickering at all, and it was sitting over those trees like a lamp somebody had hung up, and it was quiet. That is the whole of the peak of this, and I know it is not much. A cold, still night in December carries sound a very long way in that country. On a night like that, you can hear a diesel on the state road from my mother's porch, and that is 2 miles. I stood there, and I listened for 4 or 5 minutes with my arms folded, and there was a dog somewhere, and there was the creek, and there was no engine, no generator, no pump, nothing at all under a light that big, a light that size with nothing running underneath it. I went back in and the board was up again, and I worked until 1:30 in the morning. Stan came to fetch me at the end of it. He had been on shift, and he had heard as much as anybody, and he drove me home the long way round, without either of us saying so, out toward the church and up to where the road was closed, because we both wanted to look, and neither of us would say it. There was a car across the road with a man beside it, and he was perfectly pleasant, and he said the road was shut, and we said all right and turned round in a farm lane. I have thought about that man for 60 years. He was somebody's son. He was probably freezing. He knew exactly as much as we did, which is to say that somebody had told him where to stand. The volunteers came back through the following day in 1s and 2s. Wilbur, that had the feed store, the 2 Krajnak boys, a school teacher. They were not frightened, they were annoyed, the way men are when they have been out in the cold all night, and then sent home from their own woods. None of them would say much. 2 of them would not say anything at all, ever, and one of those 2 was my cousin. That is what I mean about the town going quiet. It was not ordered, nobody was leaned on. It was just 40 men who had been embarrassed in front of each other, and a fire hall full of coffee, and by Christmas it was a thing you did not raise. I will tell you what people say happened after that, and I will tell you which part is mine. People say a flatbed came out of those woods late that night with something on it under a tarpaulin. I did not see it. Men I trusted said they saw it, and men I also trusted said the first lot were making more of it than there was, and those 2 groups argued about it at the fire hall suppers for 40 years, and some of them died still arguing. What is mine is the pad. It is all in the pad, with the times. The paper next morning said the search of the woods had turned up nothing at all, and that was that for a very long while. Then, decades on, when I was an old woman, there was a lawsuit, a federal one, brought to make the space agency go and look for its own paperwork about that night. And it worked, after a fashion. Boxes of documents came out of it. I read about it in the newspaper, and my son printed some of it for me off his computer, and a good deal of what came out amounts to this: that the records which would have told anybody anything had been lost. Sometime in the 1980s, and nobody could say by whom or how. I want to be fair. Paperwork does get lost. I have lost paperwork. It is not a wicked thing. It is a filing cabinet in a hallway and somebody retiring. But I sat with that newspaper and I thought about my hall cupboard. Because my carbons are in that cupboard, 11 years of books, and the 9th of December 1965 is in one of them, in my own hand, with the time written at the top left of every single slip. What the woman on the farm said, what time she said it, what time the truck started, what time the call stopped being neighbors. And so far as I've ever been able to find out, that is the most complete account of that evening that exists anywhere in the world. It is in a cupboard in Pennsylvania between a box of Christmas cards and a vacuum cleaner. And it does not explain one single thing. That is the joke of it, if it is a joke. I have the best record anybody has, and the best record anybody has is a list of what time-frightened people telephoned. It proves that the evening happened. Nobody ever doubted that the evening happened. Not one line of it comes within a mile of telling you what was over those trees. I still write the time at the top of everything. Shopping lists, the back of envelopes. My granddaughter thinks it is charming and I've let her think that. Maybe it was a satellite come down, one of theirs or one of ours, and it was hot and it was awkward, and men were sent to fetch it and told not to chat about it, and the whole county got carried away, and I got carried away with them. That is probably it. That is very likely it. I have the times. I have had the times for 60 years. Nobody has ever come and asked me for the times. I did not see anything at all. I have thought about it every week for 30 years anyway. I worked in the kitchen at a school outside Ruwa, which is a small place about 20 kilometers from Harare in Zimbabwe. Bread and butter for 200 children, twice a day, and tea for the teachers. My name is Naomi. I was 38. This was the morning of the 16th of September, 1994. It was the end of the dry season then. Everything pale, everything dusty, the mornings cold, and the middle of the day warm, and that particular hard light you get before the rains come. The kitchen had a serving hatch onto the corridor and a boiler in the corner that took 20 minutes to come up and complained the whole time. From where I stood at the bench, I could see about a meter of corridor and the top of the doorway and nothing else at all. Beyond the playing ground, there was scrub, thorn and small trees and long grass, and the children were not to go into it because of snakes, and of course they went into it constantly, and every teacher there knew that and pretended otherwise. It was a fee-paying school, and the children came out from Harar in the morning, most of them, and their parents were farmers and doctors and people who worked in town. I did the bread order on a Monday, and it never changed in 9 years. 440 slices a day, and I cut them myself, and I gave the crusts to a woman who kept chickens. I had been there 9 years. I want to explain what that means because it is the whole of what I have to offer. I knew that break the way you know your own house at night. 9 years, twice a day. I could tell you from inside that kitchen where on the field the noise was heaviest. I could tell you when it had gone past halfway without a clock from how the shouting had changed. I could tell you whether it was a football day. And in the last 2 minutes before the bell there is a particular sound, a sort of rising, because they are getting it all out before they have to be quiet. That morning the noise stopped. Not faded, not moved off to another part of the field. Stopped in the middle of break and stayed stopped. I remember thinking a teacher had come out and got hold of somebody, because that is what a silence like that usually means, and I remember being a little sorry for whichever child it was. And then it went on. And it went on longer than any telling off, and I stood there with my hands in a bowl, and I did not go and look, and I've had 30 years to be sorry about that. Then they came in, 60 of them, perhaps more, through that doorway, and they did not make a sound. I want you to understand that children coming in from break, is the loudest thing in the world. It is a wave. You hear them at the far end of the corridor, and it arrives, and it goes past you, and the whole building rings. 9 years I had heard that door do that. They came in quiet. Not creeping, not frightened, quiet, walking. And some of them were holding hands, small ones and big ones together. Children who did not hold hands. Children who would rather have died than hold a hand at that age. I was holding a bread knife. I put it down on the board. That is the whole of my story. That is the most that ever happened to me. I have told it perhaps 20 times in 30 years, and every time I get to the doorway I have to stop for a second. There was a girl who was always first at the hatch. Always. She was 7, and she was extremely serious about bread, and I used to keep the end piece back for her, which I was not supposed to do. She came and stood at the hatch, and she did not ask for anything. She said, "Was the man in the field a person? That is all." In a perfectly ordinary voice, the voice you would use to ask what day it was. I said I did not know, because I did not, and I still do not, and it was the only honest answer I have ever given her. Nobody was crying. I've come back to that more than anything else. Later, there was crying, once the grown-ups arrived and started asking, and any child will cry if you ask it enough. But in those first 2 minutes, coming through that door, not one of them was crying. And children of that age cry about everything. They cry about the wrong color cup. The teachers were in a meeting the whole time. They came out to a school that had gone strange, and they listened to the children, and they set it aside, kindly, completely, the way you set aside a story about a dragon, and they sent everybody back to class. I watched that happen through the hatch, and I said nothing, because who was I? I have thought about that too. I was the woman who did the bread. It was not my place. It would not have made one difference in the world. And still. That afternoon I finished my shift as usual. I washed down the bench and I turned the boiler off and I walked to the road for the bus, and the field was empty and perfectly ordinary, and the grass in the scrub was moving a little in the way it does at 4 o'clock. I stood there a while and looked at it. There was nothing to see. There has never been anything to see. Then, over the next days, they drew it. That is the part I would put in front of anybody who wanted to argue with me. And I do not want to argue with anybody. I am too old. They drew it separately. In different rooms on different days, some of them with a teacher standing over them, and some of them at home at a kitchen table. Children who did not sit together. Children who did not like each other. Children who could not draw at all, and I mean that plainly. There were children in that school who could not draw a house. And the drawings were the same. Not similar, I know the difference. Children copy, of course they copy. I have raised 2 of my own. But this was a shape, and then 2 figures, and then eyes, and the eyes were done the same way by a 6-year-old and by a girl of 12 who had never in her life spoken to him. After that came everybody. The parents came the next morning and made a great deal of noise, which was the loudest that school ever was. A man came with a camera from the BBC and filmed the children talking, and they were very calm in front of it, calmer than the adults. A woman came with a notebook and asked them to draw, and in November a professor came all the way from America, and he sat with them one at a time, and he was gentle with them. That is the only thing I will say about him, because it is the only thing I saw. And then, over the years, everything else. Films, arguments, people writing that it was hysteria, people writing that it was not. One of the boys, grown up, saying on a television program that he had made the whole thing up as a joke, and it had run away from him. And others who were there, standing up and saying that he had not, that he had said something quite different when he was a child, and it was filmed at the time. All of it is on the record. Every bit of it. There's more record about that morning than about anything else that ever happened in Ruwa, and every part of the record disagrees with some other part. The drawings are still the drawings. I am old now, and I live with my daughter, and there's a shoebox in the cupboard in the passage. There is one drawing in it. A girl gave it to me. Not the one from the hatch, a different one, a quiet one, about 2 weeks after. She said somebody should have it. She did not say why me. I have never known why me. It is on ordinary school paper, and it has gone soft at the folds. There is a shape, and there are 2 small figures standing a little apart from it, and there is a line for the ground. And she has put the grass in, every blade of it all the way across, which must have taken her a long time. I take it out perhaps twice a year, usually in September, which I did not do on purpose, and only noticed after about 10 years. Maybe they made a story together, the way children do, and it got away from all of them. And by the time the grown-ups came, it was too big to put down. That is probably it. That is very probably it. I have 4 grandchildren, and I've seen a story go round a room. But they came in without a sound. 9 years I worked there, twice a day, and I never heard that door do that before, and I never heard it do it again. The cupboard is in the passage, near the window, and in the afternoon the light comes along the floor and reaches about as far as my foot. I put the lid back on, I put the box back on the shelf, and I go and put the kettle on, and that is all there is.